see everyone that has made it out. Another cool night. It's been getting colder all day, so evidently weather's not hardly over with yet, our cold winter. We want to continue tonight for a few minutes in John that I've been studying from. We're up to the 18th chapter of John. Remember, Jesus has just been meeting with the disciples, and the last couple of chapters really gone over a lot of material, a lot of lessons for all of them and indeed for us. And although the disciples still at this point don't actually realize all that's about to transpire, they don't know that this is really the last few days of Jesus' life here on earth. And he has left the upper room, has instructed them in things they need to do, and give this lengthy lesson through chapter 16 and 17. But he knows that his hour is come, as we read in chapter 17 there in verse 1, saying, "Father, the hour is come." He knows what lies ahead. And we find as we begin looking at chapter 18, of course, his betrayal by Judas and the arrest. But we read these first few verses for an introduction of our lesson tonight. So chapter 18, verse 1 says, "When Jesus had spoken these words," and that's all of this last, that lengthy message that he's just spoken to his disciples, says he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with him. Now, and when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you, I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." So with this reading on our mind, we have much to be thankful for tonight. So let's humble ourselves in some manner while the one selected leads our mind in a word of prayer. There's a lot of information as we look into the study here in John, and it helps us as we read and see the words that's left for us. It helps us to understand the situation and kind of what's going on at the time. We must remember that the Jews are still under Roman rule. They're subject to Rome and the Roman rule. So we see this whole event of Jesus' arrest and this trial that's really kind of a sham or a mock trial. It was against the rules, against the laws of the time. And we see that each group had particular authority. And the Jews themselves, Rome had give them authority to kindly deal with their own people, and especially on Pentecost when these great crowds would come, these Roman rulers would let the Jews and their courts deal with some of the lesser offenses. And it would take some of the burden off of them for keeping the peace. But there was really two phases of, as we begin to look into Jesus' arrest and his trial. So there was one, the Jewish, and this was began, as we'll look at here, with Annas and the Sanhedrin. And this was a group of men that was roughly 21 men that had authority over the Jews in this Jewish phase. We might think of it somewhat like our Supreme Court of our country, that disputes would come up between law or whatever would come up to this group, and they would make the final decision. But we see here in these first 9 verses that Jesus leads his disciples out to the garden, and Jesus knows what is soon to happen and what is going to transpire. So when Judas betrays Jesus, you know, the Jews at this time, they are very concerned of Jesus being the king and taking away their power and their authority. So they had vowed to kill Jesus in order that they may stay in power. So we see them coming, and Judas is soon to betray Jesus, and they bring soldiers, fully armed soldiers, ready to do battle. And of course, the disciples are not aware of what is soon to happen. They have vowed to be with Jesus until death. And we see these groups coming together as we begin to look and begin to study here. So in verse 10, we find once Jesus has confronted these troops and these soldiers, it says, Peter, you know, is always the swift to act and fly off and sometimes say things he shouldn't. But we see Simon Peter here reacting immediately. It says, he having a sword, he drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? So we see Peter, he's quick to react. He's ready to defend Jesus and try to keep these soldiers from arresting him. And we see, of course, Jesus rebuking him and saying, you know, he has come to do his work, that he has come. So, you know, it kind of goes back to some of the Old Testament teachings of they who live by the sword will die by the sword. We see this really kindly all through life. Some call it karma. But those who are quick to react and can't control their temper, that are quick to fight and move to violence, you know, we see in reality that those are the ones that usually will die a violent death. So Jesus is rebuking Peter and telling him, put away his sword. We've not come tonight to do a physical battle. And we see, of course, that's what Peter done. But we see as we go on here in verse 12, it says, then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas for he was the father-in-law of Cephas, who was the high priest that year. And now it was Cephas who advised the Jews that was expedient that one man should die for the people. So we see Peter, of course, cutting off Malchus' ear, and Jesus healed his ear. In Matthew each of the Gospels, describe this occurrence just a little different, but Matthew said in Matthew 26:52, put up again a sword into its place, Peter, for they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. So that's similar to what we were just talking about. And Jesus, of course, did heal his ear and put it back. So we see now that once Jesus is arrested, and this is the first phase, we might call the Jewish phase of Jesus' arrest and his trial. So he comes before Cephas, and we find that, we see each of these judges, so to speak, are reluctant in what they're finding and how they handle Jesus. And we see, of course, here that the Cephas, and he turns back over this authority or his responsibility, really, as he is not wanting to carry on. So we see the effect now as Peter and these other disciples are unsure what's going to happen and what they're going to do. We find verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? And we see Peter's first denouncement of not knowing Jesus. Remember, Christ had told Peter he would deny him 3 times before the cock crew. So this is the first time Peter said, I am not. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So we see, of course, here Peter's denial, and all of the Gospels talk of this in much the very same way of how they record this. And we see now Jesus is being questioned by this high priest as he's brought into this courtyard. In verse 19, it says, The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. So the high priest is trying to find out more information about what's going on and why the Jews have brought Jesus into him. And verse 22, it says, When he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of evil. But if well, why do you strike me? So we see Jesus, of course, being treated very violently, and his suffering is just starting as he's arrested and brought before these trials. And Cephas is one who kindly gave counsel and gave advice to the Jews. At this particular time, Annas had lost the title of the high priest and was the father son-in-law of Cephas, as what it's saying here. But during this whole time, the Sanhedrin was gathering together, and Jesus was being led into this court of the high priest. So Jesus is before Cephas, and of course Cephas asked Jesus about his disciples and what he's been teaching, and of course the Jews are trying to raise up the possibility of an insurrection, that he said he was king and he's a threat to the Roman authority. He's trying to get people on their side against Jesus. So, Jesus' answer, he merely replied that, he wasn't doing nothing in secret. He wasn't holding meetings and planning the overthrow of anybody. He had taught openly for all to hear. And he was not doing anything, hiding anything, any of his teachings. He was teaching openly in the synagogues and on the mountainsides as the large crowds had followed him and, of course, had witnessed his miracles that he had done. So we see here Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and Matthew at this point goes into a little bit more detail. It was illegal for the time of day that they met, and they had two different meetings that was against the law. And we remember that the Jews and this Jewish phase of the trial, they did not have the authority to convict one of death. They could merely find him guilty of a lesser cause than death. So they are already going to sentence Jesus to death. They know their aim and their false witnesses that they're going to call. So after this, we find them moving then on to the Roman phase. And of course, only Rome ruler would have the authority to issue the death sentence. It's also interesting for us to remember that this particular time, the usual method of execution was stoning. And they would, many of the death sentences, of course, they would gather around and stone people to death, throw these stones. So as we see all of these things happening, everything is completely out of the ordinary, and the Jews are more and more determined to see that Jesus is killed. So they brought these false witnesses, and even though they could convict someone, they had no authority to sentence them to death. And this was all at the same day, in the morning and night, that they had met and done this on the Jewish side and that Jewish phase. So it talks of when morning came. So the timing is interesting too. So as we read on down beginning in verse 24, it says, Then Annas sent him bound to Cephas, the high priest, and Peter denies Christ again. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, You're not also one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. This is the second time. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, and was evidently well aware that Malchus had his ear cut off and Jesus put it back on, recognized Peter. Said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter then denied him again, and immediately the rooster crowed. So the Jesus saying to Peter had come true, that you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And this is exactly what has happened. So now they come to Pilate's court, and they're entering into this Roman phase where the Romans and the high priest are taking over. Verse 28 says, Then they led Jesus from Cephas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? So Pilate, of course, is wondering, this Jesus, who he's not aware that's been leading any rebellion or any group or soldiers against the Roman authority, he's asking the Jews, why are you bringing this man to me? And Pontius Pilate, at this particular time, we realize of his great authority. He was not only the ruler of the time, the civil commander, but he was the commander of all of the military in the area. So he had dual roles of his responsibility and his authority that he had. So he normally didn't come to Jerusalem, but because this was the time of the Passover, they had extra soldiers and more people there to help keep the peace and keep people from getting unruly. So we find in verse 30, they answering Pilate answered and said to him, If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. You know, we find this time the Jews and the Roman authorities didn't get along real well either, nor with the Sanhedrin. So we can see in these conversations that take place, we can see a little antagonism and kind of anger between these two groups. He said, you know, in a sense, why are you bringing him to me? And he said, well, if he hadn't done nothing, we wouldn't be here. So that's kind of a little brief reply back to him. So then we find in verse 31, Pilate said to him, You take him and judge him according to your law. He's saying he can see he didn't do nothing guilty of death. You take care of him and get me out of this. So he's wanting to wash his hands of the matter. And these Jewish leaders, you know, they were filled with hate for Jesus, and they were ready to do anything to get their will, their hatred of Jesus and get him killed. So we see this hatred as we study and look into these different passages and what's happening. So after Pilate told him, you know, take him back and judge him according to your law, and don't come to me. Well, we find the Jews saying, Therefore the Jews said to him, It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. That saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. So we see here the Jews are appealing to Pilate that they cannot demand the death penalty. Only he has that authority. So then Pilate entered the praetorium again and called Jesus and said to him, Are you king of the Jews? So we see, you know, Pilate trying to get more information. He understands and sees that the Jews are pushing more than ever for Jesus' execution, so he goes to Jesus. They said, Are you king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Well, Jesus answered, It says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. So Jesus is reasoning with Pilate. He's really saying, I'm no physical threat to the authority of Rome. I'm not trying to bring up an insurrection to fight against you. He's talking of the spiritual nature and of his love, for mankind. He knows his destiny, and he knows what he has been sent to earth to do. And he's willing, to obey his Father's will, even though he knows of the pain and the agony that is soon to come. So, we see that Pilate at this particular time had thought that the Jews' charges against Jesus may have been just a religious disagreement, over text or over a theory or thought. But as he's finding out, they intend to convict Jesus of insurrection as being a king, and which would require the death penalty, and that's what they are fighting for. So, as the Jews fight more and more to convict Jesus, we find them going quickly against their own law, and of course disobeying it with false witnesses and everything they can do to get Jesus convicted. So verse 37 says, Pilate therefore said to him, Are you a king then? Jesus answered, You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And those are Jesus' words of wisdom as he answers Pilate here, and as he leaves these words for the disciples later on and us to look back on. I've come into the world that I should bear witness to the truth and fulfill his Father's will. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So that intrigued Pilate even more. He said to him, What is truth? He said, Well, how do you define truth? What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault with this in him at all. So Pilate quickly understands what's going on here, that it's nothing guilty of death that Jesus has done, but it's the Jews' hatred for Jesus that they are bringing up and that they are really pushing. So we see here that before Pilate, knowing that he's innocent, and he tries to find a way out of pronouncing this death sentence upon Jesus. And at the feast of the Passover, it was very customary that they release one prisoner during this feast. So Pilate thinks of Barabbas, that his well-known thief, and he thinks he's found a way out, that who they could release. You want to release this thief who's robbed and killed, or do you want to release this quiet religious man, Jesus? Verse 39 says, You have a custom that I should release someone to you at Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And then they all cried again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. So there was a lot of information at the time about Barabbas, who was really a violent man. And of course, Pilate thought, instead of releasing him out on society again, surely they'll release Jesus, who really didn't harm anyone. But we find them more determined than ever. And we see that the Jews are more and more now determined to have Jesus executed. So hopefully it kind of helps as we've looked and as we studied these chapters verse by verse, and kind of understand by seeing what all's going on and understanding the authority and the divisions and the great hatred at this time, what's leading up to Jesus' arrest and his death sentence that he's soon to receive. But tonight, as any night, in closing, we want to offer an invitation. We know as Christians we have the gift of eternal life. We have to obey Christ's plan of salvation by hearing the word of the Lord and believing what we hear and what we study. And if we know we're not following his word, if we've not obeyed that plan of salvation, that we have to obey that to become a Christian, to repent and change a life of the world and be determined to follow Christ and his way, the straight and narrow way. Hearing that word, believing it, repenting, or being willing to change and confess openly that I believe Jesus is the Son of God, and being baptized for the remission of our sins. And that's the beginning of the journey. We're to follow him, obey his commands the rest of our life. We know it's not always going to be joyous and happy occasion, but we too are going to have pain and we're going to have sorrow. But we look to the Lord for our strength in time of trouble. So he offers us a second law of pardon. If we know we've stepped off of that straight and narrow path, if we've said, done things contrary to his word, we're told to confess those faults one to another and pray one for another that you may be healed. If there be one of either case, won't you come forward as we sing our invitation hymn?
We appreciate you for taking time to watch this video. If you have further questions or would like to study the Bible further, please email us at churchofchrist@chestnutridge@gmail.com.